Let's do this way then.
Okay, welcome everyone. We are live. This is Addy Ads, YouTube's chosen one. I have a very special guest here with me this evening, Mr. Richard Gage, AIA. He's a 30-year-old, excuse me.
Wow, thank you.
Oh yeah, good background there, Mr. Gage.
Yeah, nice.
Give me one sec here. Okay, so as I was saying, Mr. Gage, AIA, is a 30-year San Francisco Bay Area architect and member of the American Institute of Architects. He's the founding member of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. Mr. Gage became interested in researching the destruction of the World Trade Center high-rises after hearing the startling conclusions of a reluctant 9/11 researcher, David Ray Griffin, on the radio in 2006, which launched his own unyielding quest for the truth about 9/11. AE 9/11 Truth now numbers more than 3,000 architects and engineers, demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center high-rise buildings on 9/11. As an architect, he has worked on most types of building construction, including numerous fireproofed steel-framed buildings. Most recently, he worked on the construction documents for a $400 million mixed-use urban project with 1.2 million square feet of retail, parking structure, and mid-rise office space, altogether about with 1,200 tons of steel framing. Mr. Richard Gage, AIA, thank you for chatting with me this evening.
Love chatting you, Addy. No problem. It's fun. I'm grateful for the opportunity.
Well, let's get into it right away, Mr. Gage. I actually don't know too much about this. I have recently been really interested in it, and it piqued my interest a few months ago, but it wasn't until a couple weeks ago that I started kind of doing my own research in my spare time. But let's just start with what the story usually is, or the official story.
Oh, the official story about let's talk. We got 3 skyscrapers that came down, and we have 3 official stories. Shall we start with Building 7?
Yes, let's do that, because I think that's something that most people don't know about.
Yeah, it's really important because I was shocked to learn that there was a 3rd skyscraper that collapsed on 9/11. It was 13 years ago for me. I heard this on the radio from David Ray Griffin, and man, I was blown away. As an architect, I thought I would have known that 3 skyscrapers came down on 9/11. Building 7 is a 47-story skyscraper that collapses after witnesses hear explosions in the afternoon of 9/11, 7 hours after the towers had come down, the Twin Towers. And so this building drops like a rock uniformly, symmetrically, suddenly at 5:23 in the afternoon. And never before, had anything like this happen due to office fires. This building wasn't hit by an airplane. So it drops as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky, free fall acceleration. And we're told,
which is negative 9.8 meters per second squared, correct?
Yeah, this is accelerating faster and faster each second, as fast as anything can fall. And so this is just shocking. And NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain this collapse and all 3 collapses to the American people, ultimately 7 years later, after juggling this football, after saying Truthfully, we've had trouble getting a handle on the collapse of Building 7. They said it came down by normal office fires. Now, normal office fires have never brought down a skyscraper ever before 9/11. And so all of a sudden we have not 2, but 3 skyscrapers collapsing due to primarily normal office fires. Certainly not normal in the case of the Twin Towers. They had a plane hit them. We'll get to that in a moment. There were some broken columns in that case. But in Building 7, a completely unprecedented event. It should have been the most studied collapse in history. And yet most architects and engineers know nothing about it, literally nothing. So that's why we dedicate ourselves to going all around the country, alerting architects and engineers in conferences, engineering conferences. And recently we've sent 50,000 postcards to structural engineers and civil engineers. And next week we're sending 25,000 more. We're sending a report which our supporters sponsored, a 4-year major university study that concludes that NIST, basically that NIST was fraudulent in their assessment, which was a 4-year study of this building. I think they started in 2002 when FEMA had given up. So we'll get into the evidence of what really happened there. But this study put to rest, put the last nail in the coffin of the official NIST report.
And with regards to FEMA, there's an Appendix C, right?
Yes, this is extraordinary because before NIST came along and took over the investigation from FEMA had been given the authorization to study this building's collapse. And they, in their Appendix C of the Building Performance Assessment Team report in May of 2002, concluded, the Appendix C actually studied the steel, and they had discovered and documented very clearly through this WPI report, Worcester Polytechnic University, that the steel had undergone a hot sulfur corrosion attack. Liquid molten iron invading the grain boundaries of the steel. The author of the report, Jonathan Barnett, fire protection engineer, cites that the ends of the beams were partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. Well, it takes 4,000 degrees to evaporate steel. So where did that heat come from? Didn't come from jet fuel. No plane hit this building, and it couldn't have come from jet fuel anyway, had one hit this building. It didn't come from normal office fires. We're talking maybe 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit for normal office fires. 25% of the temperatures required to melt steel or to evaporate steel. To melt steel, it takes 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Nowhere near those temperatures. And yet here's this documentation by this federal agency documenting not just melted steel, but liquid molten iron. That's elemental iron invading the grain boundaries of the steel. Where did that come from? We'll have to talk about that. And where did the sulfur come from in this hot sulfur corrosion attack? Sulfur is added to thermite to become thermate, much more effective at cutting through steel. So what we're talking about here is the evidence of thermite. Thermite is an incendiary used by the military to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter. Its main ingredient essential ingredient is sulfur. By the way, NIST says, well, gosh, we had no we don't know where the sulfur came from, but guess what? There's sulfur in gypsum board, wall board. Well, wait a minute. The sulfur in gypsum board is calcium sulfate. It's inert. It's bonded. It doesn't come out and attack the steel that gypsum wallboard has been designed to protect for 100 years or so.
Could you explain a couple of those terms a little bit more in depth, just for some people listening who may not be familiar with them?
Sure. Which terms are we referring to specifically?
Just the board you're talking about that goes against the steel, because some people, I think, who have done maybe construction will have an idea of what you're trying to reference.
Yeah, sorry, I've been an architect for 30 years or so.
Yeah, that's all right.
This is gypsum wallboard. You have it in your house. 99% of you, everywhere inside your house. We've used it to not just, one reason we use it in houses because it's not flammable. We use it to protect steel by building wall, if you will, around the steel to keep the fire from getting to it. It's very, very protective. It forms a protective layer against fire and temperatures, and it doesn't attack the steel. There's been experiments done, in fact, that show that in 2,000 degree fires they managed to get it doesn't phase the steel. So that's not where the sulfur came from. So where did the sulfur come from? Well, again, sulfur is added to thermite, which is an incendiary that we talked about. It cuts through steel incredibly. So the question is there evidence of thermite, other evidence other than that, as if that's not enough, in the World Trade Center aftermath? Yeah, there's a lot of evidence for thermite, as a matter of fact. It creates molten iron. That's where we can get molten iron from. See, thermite is composed of iron oxide powder and aluminum powder. And there's a chemical reaction between the two when they're ignited in a mixed powdered form. And the result is liquid molten iron of 4,000 degrees. So we've got the temperatures that were easily found here. The cause of them can easily be found if we consider thermite as in the equation, because all of these different agencies documented temperatures of 2,800 degrees under the fires. We're talking Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, for instance, the Bechtel doing site studies, and OSHA finding these incredible temperatures. The first responders saying the ends of the beams were dripping with molten metal. Well, how does that happen? These are the cleanup workers. I mean, the ends of the steel beams are not even fireproof. Well, if they had thermite-shaped cutter charges placed on them to cut through them, then that's would account for what is also seen and documented in our landmark documentary, for instance, 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out, where we've assembled 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out this evidence. And in it, we show the ejected steel beams ejected laterally out of the towers, 600 feet away, landing ejected at 60 to 80 miles per hour, with the ends of these beams smoking, incredible smoke clouds trailing them, thick white smoke clouds. So this, again, steel is not flammable. So what's causing that? Well, this is a thermite shaped cutter charges would be responsible for that, or could be. So we also look to the dust for clues from the U.S. Geological Survey, who does hundreds and hundreds of studies on different dust samples, and they find what? Liquid molten iron droplets that they can't explain where they came from. They're almost naked to the human eye. They are found in every sampling, millions and millions of them in each sampling. Up to 6% of the content of the World Trade Center dust is composed of these previously molten iron microspheres. And they document them very carefully, as does R.J. Lee Group, an environmental consulting firm, who says that these are formed during the event, not before, by the construction workers who were welding, which it would have a different chemical constituency anyway. Not after, by the iron workers who are cutting through the steel, trying to cut it into pieces to get it moved, but during the event. So this is incredible evidence, and it's also documented by physicist Stephen Jones, who does studies on the dust, including electron microprobe data, X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy. Don't ask me to define those terms, but that's how they study to find out the constituency of the signature, chemical signature of these materials. He finds that these have, in the case of one of the pieces of slag, iron again and aluminum, indicating partially unignited material, like forming the slag on the ends of these steel beams, which were given to him, provided by sculptors, because these beams were sent all around the country and around the world. And so this is living evidence, again, of thermite. In fact, he finds that they have a lot of manganese. So this is not molten steel. This is something else. Well, manganese comes from the potassium permanganate, which is used as an oxidizer in thermite cutter charges, or thermite charges. Regarding cutter charges, we don't have too many buildings being taken down with incendiaries, other than in the military. The controlled demolition companies, and that's what we're talking about here, is controlled demolitions. They use high energy explosives like C4 and RDX, but those provide extremely loud bangs and very bright flashes. So they wouldn't want that in a deceptive controlled demolition. So apparently they chose to use thermite, which, by the way, was patented, or shaped cutter charges were patented for use with thermite prior to 9/11. It issues molten iron in hundreds of milliseconds, much more effective at cutting through much thicker sections of structural steel, like we have at the World Trade Center, up to 4-inch thick slabs of steel to make up these composite columns that are incredibly strong down at the bottom. So this is how a building can drop at free fall as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky, because you take out the structure underneath it. You get kicked in the knees and you go down. Now you're likely to go sideways unless it's perfectly symmetrical, which is what they do in controlled demolitions. They want the building, a high-rise particularly, to come straight down, not tip over and destroy the rest of. Well, how would that happen by normal office fires? Office fires have never, again, brought down a skyscraper, and they work asymmetrically. It's a chaotic organic process fire. It's not going to take out all the columns in Building 7, for instance, at once. And yet that's exactly what was concluded in this major university study by the University of Alaska. Professor Leroy Halsey, the department of the chair, the civil engineering department there, determined that all the columns in the building had to be taken out at once in order for this building to fall the way it did. Now, that's a 4-year study we're talking about there. So I'm going on and on.
No, you're good, Gage. I was just wanted to ask, was there an official explanation given for the evidence of that molten steel that in that sample? I think you said it was like 6%.
Oh, yeah, molten iron.
Iron. Okay.
No, there's no speculation on the part of NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who did this report. They were tasked with explaining these 3 collapses to the American people, tasked by Congress. There's no explanation by them. They just simply ignore it altogether. Doesn't even appear in their very frequently asked questions about the destruction of these buildings, which look so much like controlled demolition, particularly Building 7, a classic implosion, just like the old hotels in Las Vegas. Witnesses hear explosions also. One of them says, like a train running under my feet, like you wanted to grab onto something. I knew that was an explosion, says Kevin McPadden. Barry Jennings was in the building with Mayor Giuliani's attorney, Michael Hess. He says, the explosions, he says there were explosions. They blew us back up into the 8th floor. See, they didn't realize that Building 7 had been evacuated after the planes hit the towers. They arrive at the site late, and they're trying to get back up into the building. And they're experiencing all these explosions. He said the lobby was destroyed. This is before the Twin Towers had come down. So why is there all these explosions in Building 7 that are almost killing them? They're very lucky to be alive. He said they were dead bodies that they were crawling over. It's pretty incredible story when you try to just blame it on fires. And there were only a few scattered fires in Building 7. On our website, ae911truth.org, you can see readily this building falling. You can also see the incredible video footage we have of these fires, which just show a few small scattered fires.
I will definitely put those links in the description box below, as well as the rest of your links, Mr. Gage. The thermite evidence after the fact, was that found at all 3 sites?
It's found throughout the World Trade Center dust, and the steel, which is the dust itself spread in a blanket 4 inches thick from river to river across lower Manhattan, 3 square miles. All this dust contains these previously molten iron microspheres that are documented by the USGS, R.J. Lee, and several others. So yes, this and the steel itself, it's obvious which building, which steel came from. Well, all the steel that we have left, 98% of it was actually destroyed illegally. This is evidence in a crime scene, and yet it's taken before forensic investigators could do a proper investigation. So we have.
And who took that? Who like stole the evidence?
Well, there's a lot of finger pointing. FEMA is involved. Mayor Giuliani is involved in the orders to take the steel to the landfill. They're trying to get it out of there. Well, from the landfill, it was put on barges and shipped to China for recycling. This is acknowledged by China and many others. 15 cents a pound. It's a ridiculous price. And starting just 2 weeks after 9/11, that steel was taken out of there.
Wow. So most of it was ended up being sold to China. And for those that don't know, FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So yeah, FEMA, formed in 1979, headquarters in DC. So for anybody that didn't know that. And as far as Building 7 goes, was that kind of the catalyst for you, Mr. Gage, as far as what set this off?
Yeah, I have to say so, because it's the smoking gun of the crime. You know, the criminal investigators are always looking for the smoking gun. Well, here you have the perfect smoking gun. A building which it obviously looks like a controlled demolition, exactly like the old hotels in Las Vegas. No, you can't even tell them apart. We have them side by side on our documentary, 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out. You have a building that has the forensic evidence of thermite being used. You have explosions heard before it went down, and and yet you have it blamed on fire, which is never brought down a skyscraper, and which were, small and scattered throughout the building. So that's the essence of the smoking gun. And yeah, and the fact that nobody knows about it. Architects and engineers are shocked when they stop by our booth and they see on the video Building 7 coming down, and we go, you know what that is? And they go, well, it looks like a controlled demolition. Sure. And then we show them, no, that happened on 9/11. And you say, well, wait, what? That doesn't look like one of the Twin Towers. And we say, no, this was the third skyscraper, and you didn't know about it? No. The American Institute of Architects, over this one here, of which I'm a member, has hold on.
You right there, Mr. Gage?
Lost power there for a second. Has not issued one bulletin on the collapse of Building 7, the third worst structural failure in modern history. The American Society of Civil Engineers has done very little also, other than to publish 2 days after 9/11. There we are, 2 days after 9/11. This peer-reviewed paper, which is extremely complicated to try to prove. In this case, is about the Twin Towers. Everybody else is trying to figure out, well, what just happened to us? We're in shock, right? What terrorists, airplanes? What happened here? But within 2 days, it's extremely sophisticated, I would say, but fraudulently full of errors. This paper purports to show how the Twin Towers came down. And the theory is, in the case of the Twin Towers, that we have this upper part above the point of jet plane impacts. 15 stories in the case of the North Tower, driving the rest of the building down to the ground after the steel gave way due to being heated and weakened by the fires, drove the rest of the building down to the ground, straight down uniformly, symmetrically into its own footprint, pretty symmetrically, almost at free fall. In this case, in the case of Building 7, it was free fall. In the case of the Twin Towers, the physicists have clocked it at 64% of free fall. That is accelerating straight down, faster and faster and faster, straight down through the path of what should have been the greatest resistance but which must have been removed in order for this building to accelerate. And so in the case of Zdenek Bazant from Chicago Northwestern University, who drafted this paper and submitted it 2 days after 9/11, that just really gets me.
We got a question here, Mr. Gage, from Venus. She says, wasn't it reported that it fell down before it actually did? And she's referring to Building 7. I thought I heard that too. Was that the BBC?
Wasn't yeah. In the case of Building 7, jumping back to Building 7 now, yes, the BBC reported the collapse of Building 7 20 minutes before it ever happened. And so it's incredible because, you have the unprecedented collapse of a skyscraper by fire, and yet the BBC has announced it early. They apologized for this grievous error, citing the confusing events of the day. Does this make them psychic? I mean, what's going on here? Actually, CNN announced it at 11:07. They announced the collapse of a 50-story building. They said a firefighter went by. Aaron Brown is reporting down there. He said a firefighter went by and said a 50-story building went down, the canyon filled with smoke. Well, wait a minute. The building doesn't go down until 5:20, about 6 hours later. Well, had Building 7 come down at that time, we wouldn't even have videos of it because it would have been completely obscured by the massive dust cloud which erupted when the Twin Towers went down. So was it supposed to go down at that time is the question. It was obviously a controlled demolition. So probably. And we have these construction workers, that are caught on CNN camera walking away from Building 7, hearing an explosion. Probably, no, it wasn't the same explosion Barry Jennings heard. It was another one. They look back over their shoulder at the Building 7. They look straight into the CNN camera and they say, "Did you hear that? That building's coming down. Flame and debris coming down. The building's going to blow up." They're actually saying this. Well, that's pretty darn interesting. I mean, how do they know? I mean, the building had a few small fires in it. How do they know it's going to blow up? So all of this evidence raises suspicions at the very least.
Yeah, I would agree, Mr. Gage. And I don't know exactly where they were standing in relation to the building, because I suppose an argument they could use would be that, firefighters can intuit when a building's going to go down, right?
Well, no skyscrapers ever collapse due to fire alone.
Right.
I mean, so they can't intuit it. But an engineer did anonymously. The fire chief Hayden says, "Well, we had this engineer come by, and we asked him, in its current state, how soon could we expect it to come down?" So, and here's the fire chief presuming the building's going to come down. Well, it's the engineer who actually says in its current state it has about 5 hours. Well, this was 5 hours before the collapse that it's going to come down. So, so Hayden says he was pretty much right on the money. So you have an engineer. They won't release the name of this engineer. He's anonymous. So we've got more reason to be suspicious when these kinds of things happen. An unprecedented event being predicted to this collapse to the almost to the minute.
And you've had quite the influence since you began this this organization back in 06. I know an author I interviewed recently, I think it was last month, Mr. Charlie Robinson has been influenced by your work greatly. It's definitely gone a long way, I think, since it first began. And how do you think, because we actually haven't mentioned it yet, but how do you think this is relating to our current situation? I don't know where you are right now, Mr. Gage, but I'm of course referring to the pandemic.
Oh, the pandemic. Yeah, we had a planned demolition, and now we got a pandemic. Yeah, there's a lot of parallels here. You have, which we didn't even get into, the cover up by the media. The media, 90% of which, by the way, is owned by just 5 corporations who are co-invested and co-directed along with the arms industry, the oil industry, the banking industry, the insurance industry, all of whom profited enormously from 9/11. So once again, you look at the media and they're the cheerleaders for control of people, for advertising. 70% of their advertising comes from big pharma, and which is not my statistic. This is other researchers, but it's very well understood and known.
Yeah, so you want to repeat that, Mr. Gage? So 70% of whose advertising comes from big pharma?
TV advertising comes from big pharma. Just add it up. So you have, and then they're the promoters of what else is trying to be accomplished here. The demolition of our economy, one, and the promotion of vaccines. So there's always something they're trying to sell. In this case, mandated universally across the world, where people like Bill Gates and others, Fauci himself is on the board of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who are heavily invested. They call it philanthropy, but you look into it and it's an extreme investment that they've done in vaccines. So they stand to gain billions and billions. And so this is all being pushed now down our throats, just like the Patriot Act and the Military Commissions Act shortly after 9/11, legislation which was drawn up to curtail our civil liberties and after 9/11. So the parallels are incredible, and the control grid is tightening, as you can imagine and as you know, and the economy is being destroyed as it was. Not quite as bad with 9/11, but it was, the economy suffered billions and billions of damage due to the destruction, basically, of the home of Wall Street and many other reasons.
What were you doing on that day, Mr. Gage?
Well, I was minding my own business, so I'm innocent. I can't be held responsible for this. I was here in the San Francisco Bay Area, and watching on TV the news, and all of a sudden, the news is taken over by all this news. We then saw recordings of the planes hitting the towers, and the towers. I saw live the towers actually coming down. I had never seen, a controlled demolition that looked like the Twin Towers. They were very explosive, incredible geometry of fireworks, laterally ejected structural steel sections weighing 4 and 8 tons, 80 miles an hour out of the Twin Towers horizontally, landing 600 feet in every direction.
Wow.
This doesn't look anything like a typical controlled demolition or a collapse by fire. Not that we've had one in a skyscraper before, but we might expect that upper section to fall off, not drive the rest of the building down through 90,000 tons of structural steel as if it weren't even there. So, in fact, we don't even see the upper part driving down the rest of the ground as NIST claims, and is backed in theory by the paper that we talked about from Zdenek Bazan of Chicago Northwestern University. The upper section, in 15 stories in the case of the North Tower, it actually is destroyed itself, just like you might expect it's a mini controlled demolition. It's not there after 4 seconds. It's gone. So after that, what we have is, and by the way, before that, we have 156 first responders talking about explosions in these buildings before the collapse of these buildings. It's absolutely incredible. This is researched by Graham McQueen in the 500 first responders who have been put on tape, orally recorded, talking about all of these explosions before the collapse and flashes of light. And then the building comes down. Most of them are describing this order of events very specifically. Well, then we have the destruction of the upper part in 4 seconds. After that is when we have the lateral expulsion of these incredible structural steel sections spread all over outside the boundaries of World Trade Center. By the way, if the steel, and there's hardly any steel at the base of these towers. What I mean is there's like 2% of the steel. It's a lot of steel, but there's only 2% inside the footprint of the building. Everything else is outside the footprint in this 1,400 foot radius around the towers. So how did the building get crushed? Not by the steel. You say maybe it was the concrete floors. There were like 110 of them, each an acre in size, an incredible amount of weight. But we don't find those stacked up in pancakes at the bottom of the towers either. There's only a 2-story pile of steel and twisted steel and just miscellaneous junk.
And when you
I
say,
don't mean to discredit the.
oh no, go ahead.
I don't mean to discredit the victims here when I say junk. Their body parts were everywhere, including up to 800 feet outside the perimeter of the steel frame buildings as well. What were you going to say?
Wow. I was just going to say or ask about what you meant by footprint. Is that basically just underneath the base of the building?
Well, the footprint would be the outer footprint. The buildings are 207 feet square. So the steel, almost all of it, 99% of it, is outside that square in each of the case of the towers. So it's not available to crush the building. The concrete is not in pancakes at the bottom either. It's pulverized in midair to a fine powder, which lands in a 3 square mile area. The World Trade Center dust is found up to be 30% concrete and powdered concrete. So this dust is formed mostly, its major constituent is powdered concrete. So if it's from river to river across lower Manhattan, how could it have crushed the building also? Well, the steel and the concrete are 2/3 the weight of the building. They can't crush the building. So what's crushing the building? It's being blown up and pulverized. In fact, the people are pulverized as well. We have 2,700 people who were killed in these buildings. Well, only 300 whole bodies were found. There was one person they found 200 pieces of. And there were 6,000 body parts small enough to fit into a test tube. And yet there's still more than 1,000 people whom they found no part of whatsoever. They were vaporized. You'd expect these bodies to be found between floors in a natural collapse like this. You don't find the floors. You don't find you don't find what you'd expect. And you don't even find more than 1,000 people.
And those numbers were for all three sites?
We're talking about the Twin Towers right now with these numbers. In the case of Building 7,
okay,
the official story says there was nobody died in that collapse. But we were told that it was used as a triage site. And we were told that Barry Jennings, who we talked about earlier, walking into this building with Mayor Giuliani's attorney, Michael Hess, that they were walking over dead bodies. So that remains a discrepancy to be resolved in a real investigation.
And could you explain like what a top-down demolition is, or a bottom-up as well?
Most demolitions are designed to take out the structure of the building down low. Shaped cutter charges are put usually at 45-degree angles to separate the columns and the beams from each other and the columns from each other. And the 45 is so that it's typically kicked out with an additional kicker charge, which allows the columns to slip past each other. So if you take out the structure underneath, just like your knees, you tend to go down faster. There are controlled demolitions that have been done from the top down for various reasons, which I don't understand, but we have them on tape. Mark Loiseau of Controlled Demolition, Inc. Says in a video that you can go anywhere in the building and take the structure out. You could take it floor by floor, starting at the top. You can take out its columns, and then that allows the top floor to fall on the bottom floor. But that doesn't give you much weight as the whole building falling on the lower floor below it. He does show an example of a top-down controlled demolition. But it takes explosives on every floor, very precisely timed floor by floor, a fraction of a second after this one is set off, you have to do the next one. Otherwise, it meets the resistance of those columns. In the case of building the North Tower, building 1, it would mean that you have 80,000 tons of structural steel, which is incredibly strong, 5 times stronger than it needed to be to support this building. These buildings are way over designed. And so that steel would be there unless you precisely timed take out each floor of columns, which is what we show in the documentary. Hundreds of explosions occurring. It's very clear what's going on in this building. It's not a gravitational collapse at all. You can see dozens of explosions in this close-up view traveling down the corner of the tower. And this is the steel that's blowing out of it is falling almost as, the explosions are traveling down the corner of the building almost as fast as the steel, which is falling from above. very, very rapid. Again, about 2/3 of free fall acceleration.
Got you. Thank you for that explanation, Mr. Gage. We are going into the fourth quarter of our interview with Mr. Gage here. And I just wanted to ask a couple of questions. What recent breakthroughs have you had, if any? And what should people do if they feel compelled to take action with this? And then if you wanted to add any final thoughts as well, Mr. Gage.
Well, we're pretty excited that thousands of our supporters have funded this 4-year study from the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. It has pulled the rug out from underneath the NIST report altogether, and we're getting it to thousands and thousands of engineers. We have submitted a request for, so that's a major breakthrough. We've also done a lot of work, particularly Ted Walter on our team has been the key behind the creation of a request for correction, putting it politely. That's the official term when a major U.S. agency like NIST has performed fraud. And this is how we point it out. So this is 100-page, under the Data Quality Act, 100 pages of their fraud put in their face, which we have now given to dozens and dozens and dozens of major committee oversight committee in the House and the Senate and key Congress people. So we've been having appointments, and we're asking your listeners to join us by simply going onto our website, finding your congressperson. We have a tool there to do that if you don't know who they are, contacting them, letting them know that this is not going to fly, that there is a major university study that disproves the NIST theory about Building 7, that it came down by fire, and that you as a constituent want corrective action. And so we're asking you to make an appointment with your congressperson, which is easy to do. It's a telephone appointment. We will show up and actually give the appointment for you. So how easy can it be? Simply go to your, I know what happened. My monitor goes to sleep if I don't move my mouse every 15 minutes.
Oh, okay. We can still see you, even though.
Oh, great. I'll be sure to do that. And freaks me out anyway.
Yeah.
We'll give the appointment. A civil engineer, Roland Angle, 50-year civil engineer who's designed missile silos for blast resistance. Myself and another, Andy Steele, will be joining us, or Ted Walter. And in 10 minutes, we give them the presentation that you've just heard and the importance of it. And we're asking your congressperson to write a letter to NIST saying, hey, I want to be on the response list for this request for correction. And mid-August is when it's due from NIST. We spent a long time writing it. It's 100 pages. So they have 4 months to actually respond in detail. So this will force them to reevaluate and reconstruct a new hypothesis, or hold to their guns with the old hypothesis if they dare, in which case we will sue them in court. So we've got some great breakthroughs. We consider it a breakthrough that we've been able to get a response from the U.S. Attorney in Manhattan to our submission of a petition for a special grand jury. And they wrote back and said, we will comply with the law, which requires us to submit this 60-page exhibit of all this evidence we've been talking about to a special grand jury. Now, we don't have evidence that they've done that yet. So we filed a mandamus lawsuit requiring them to show what action they've taken toward this end. And we're hopeful about the results of that. It just takes a lot of time. We've also sued the FBI, requiring them to prove to us stakeholders, architects and engineers who have a stake in these buildings coming down at free fall acceleration due to normal office fires in the case of Building 7, and family members who have a stake in the collapse of these buildings. Well, the judge ruled that with the FBI initially that we don't have a stake, which is ludicrous. So we have now appealed that ruling. And so we move forward. And it is very exciting times having these legal options at hand to force these wayward agencies to do their job.
I didn't even know that you could sue the FBI. Does that mean you can sue the CIA too?
Yes, plenty of people have sued the CIA too. Yeah.
Wow, you learn something new every day. We do have just a couple minutes left here, Mr. Gage, and I actually wanted to ask you about books, because I love asking people about what they like to read. And it can be related to this or not, just maybe three to five books, or maybe just like one or two books that you've given away to people as a form of a gift, either or.
Yes, we do have a book, and it's called Beyond Misinformation. It's a 50-page bound book which compiles all this evidence and rips the NIST report apart. So I encourage people to put it on your coffee tables at your office and share it with colleagues. Every architect and engineer you can find, you can give it to. It's $10 in our store, or you can download it for free at beyondmisinformation.org. The DVD is, this information is very graphic though. So we encourage people to get the DVD, which is an hour and a half. The hour version is free on YouTube. So be sure to watch that. Search Experts Speak Out 9/11 on YouTube. And they'll come up with all kinds of wonderful things, especially this landmark documentary. We're also making a film, Addie. It's the maker of Loose Change, 9/11. One of them. There's three filmmakers there. Dylan Avery, who's won some film awards since then, is putting together a 45-minute film on Building 7, featuring this final report on the World Trade Center destruction by the University of Alaska. So we'll have that out. We have a 5-minute version done, which is going to be played on PBS to a guaranteed minimum of 3 million viewers. So hundreds and hundreds of our supporters have pooled their funds to support that too. So I encourage people to support us financially for these reasons as well. Excellent causes that get the word out here. We're not funded by, the CIA, the U.S. government, or big pharma, or anybody else, other than individual people who find out about this and care enough about their country to realize that these are manipulations on the American people.
Well, it's good to hear that things are trending upwards for you, Mr. Gage, despite this pandemic we're in. And what was your, just before we sign off, do you have Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or a YouTube, or just your website, if you want to list your website too?
Yes, we have all those things, and they're typically AE 911 Truth. A as an architect, E as an engineer, 911 Truth. In the case of the website, .org.
Okay, and as I said before, we will put all those links in the description box below for Mr. Gage. Mr. Gage, thank you so much for giving me some of your time this evening, and I really appreciated that and learned a lot tonight when we well, you did most of the talking, but I think that's okay because you're the expert in this realm. So my viewers, thank you as well. So yeah, I just wanted to say thanks for that, Mr. Gage. And if you want to do it again at some point when you have opening in your schedule, I would love to.
Great. Thank you so much. Let's do it, Addie. Appreciate it.
Definitely. Cheers, and thanks to everybody for listening.